Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Michael Tremblay.
And I'm Caleb Ontiveros.
And today we're going to be talking about Stoicism versus therapy, coaching, the role that philosophy, particularly Stoic philosophy, has in developing mental health and responding to challenging situations, as opposed to those maybe more popular, more traditional types of treatments or methods, something like a more traditional approach to therapy or coaching. In other words, you're at a crossroads, you're encountering some issue. Why would you turn to philosophy? What is philosophy particularly good at, and Stoicism as that philosophy, versus something like why would you go to therapy or why would you seek out coaching? What are the strengths there? What are the weaknesses? This is something that I think I've prepared some notes for this. Caleb, you disagree with some of my views, so we'll have a little bit of a debate here, which will be fun. Yeah, and I'm going to be focusing on traditional Western talk therapy. That's something that I have a bit of exposure in. I'm not an expert at that by any means. If you listen to this podcast, I would say I'm an expert in Stoicism and have a background in philosophy, but not an expert in therapy. So really, kind of how I view the roles that they play or the differences that they have. But my background is definitely in the philosophy side of things. So it's really just an attempt to make sense of what I've been chewing on for a while, which is, you're a person with a problem, and where should you go to solve that problem, and what kind of benefits do each of these different systems have? Any context you want to add before we jump into it?
I think it's a good topic because philosophy and therapy are related, and I suppose, if you encounter some adverse life event or experiencing anxiety or a sense of meaningless, whatever it is, that's the sort of thing that can bring people to Stoicism, or it can cause people to explore therapy, as it were, or perhaps get a coach, depending on the nature of the issue. So, and I think there's that question, of course, is one path more advisable than another, and what sorts of circumstances? And I think that's to tackle those sorts of questions. It's useful to distinguish what the role of philosophy is, how philosophy and therapy are distinct, and just think through where one might be better than the other. So it's a good topic, certainly.
Yeah, especially because thinking about, sometimes they talk about why there's not a lot of women in philosophy, and one of the answers I get, or not Stoic philosophy, why there's more interest in modern Stoicism for men other than women. One of the answers I get asking people about that as well. Women kind of have this pathway to therapy, or this pathway maybe to talking about these things with their friends, and there's kind of there's this view that both men and women, just as an example, are trying to solve a similar problem, and you're saying these are related but different things, and then one group goes one way, one group goes the other way. Should more men be doing, therapy instead of learning about Stoicism, and should more women be learning about philosophy, and vice versa? And that applies, I guess, in just different contexts. And so I just thought, do the thing a philosopher does. Let's define them. Let's put them in, let's parse them out. Let's understand how they're conceptually distinct and talk about that. Before we get into it, I did want to say that, modern Western talk therapy or modern kind of coaching traditions or anything like that, those are relatively recent. That wouldn't have had existed in the same form, obviously, in the time of Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius. And so the Stoics did at their time view their project, at least metaphorically, as being medical, right? So you wouldn't go to a hospital and be referred to a philosopher, be referred to a psychologist or psychiatrist. But the Stoics viewed their project as being a medical project. It's one in pursuit of health and well-being. In Epictetus's Discourses, Book 3, Chapter 24, Epictetus says, "The philosopher's lecture room is a hospital. You ought not to walk out of it in a state of pleasure, but in pain, for you are not in good condition when you arrive." You would say, well, this is a bit of a metaphor about how, it's going to be painful before you get better. But Chrysippus, third leader of the Stoic school, he also makes the same metaphor. He says, quote, just as the doctor must have intimate knowledge of the illnesses of the body, so also the doctor of the mind must have intimate knowledge of a variety of conditions of the mind. So Chrysippus is calling, what do you think about when you think about a psychologist? You think about them almost as a doctor of the mind. Chrysippus is calling the Stoic the doctor of the mind. And as you pointed out, Caleb, there's also these analogies where we call passions or extreme emotions as diseases of the soul. We talk about people that are vicious, they're not good people, as being in a kind of madness, a madness that needs curing. So there's all this. I would say, it would be interesting if you dropped Epictetus in today. If you dropped Epictetus or Seneca in today's world, they'd probably think, well, what a psychologist is doing is quite a lot of overlap to what a philosopher is doing in terms of having this pursuit of making people healthy, viewing themselves as being doctors of the soul or the mind, and viewing themselves as helping people alleviate the illnesses of the mind or remove their madness, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, and you can see that analogy continuing today. There's Martha Nussbaum, the classicist and philosopher. One of her books is entitled The Therapy of Desire. It's a book that's all about the Hellenistic philosophies, those philosophies as ways of life. And the ancient philosophers were certainly mindful of, attempting to cure these passions, as it were. If that wasn't the primary goal of some of these philosophies, it certainly was one of the selling points, if you will, or something that emerges as a side effect, or perhaps a stepping stone into that particular school. So I think then there's that question, just how tight of the metaphor is it really? In some sense, of course, philosophy isn't medical. It brings to mind that meme about someone who's fallen or something. And they say, I need help, I need a doctor. And, some other person blankly stares back, I've got you. I studied philosophy. I've got a PhD in philosophy, right? That's not the same sort of thing for an acute medical emergency. So of course they're distinct in some ways, but in other ways, what the Hellenistic philosophers were up to was, I think there's a real sense in which they were psychologists.
Yeah. And so that's the kind of argument for why there's this overlap, and then we'll try to pull apart what the differences might be. So like we agree that, philosophy, it's a treatment of sorts. So as you said, it's not something I want if I break my leg, but it's a treatment of sorts. So the question is kind of what kind, and how is that different than other kinds of treatment? So I have three main arguments. We'll structure the episode kind of going through these arguments one by one. First one is that philosophy, therapy, and life coaching aim at different goals. That's one of the fundamental differences. They target different things. They have a different aim. Second claim is that Stoicism is best when it's transformative and preventative. And I'll get into what that means, but I'm going to argue that I think Stoicism really is good for making you into a more robust kind of person. And then my third claim is that Stoicism is actually bad or comparatively worse for dealing with acute trauma, or dealing with people, or dealing in situations where things have gotten quite bad, for resolving the temporary madness that, the Stoics would say you fall into this madness when, something really terrible has happened, you're in a bad way. It's not actually that good at that. It's more for the person who has time to be reflective, comparatively to something like therapy. It's more for the person who has time to be reflective and transformative. But we'll go through those one by one. I know, Caleb, you disagree with some of those. You might push back, and so we'll have a nice debate.
Cool. Let's do it.
So number one, Stoicism and therapy aim at different goals. I mean, that's probably non-controversial until I get into what they are. So I was doing some reading on this and kind of thinking about, what is therapy versus, how I treat philosophy. And what I'll propose is that therapy focuses on the past and present. So it's backwards looking, and it's also not prescriptive. So it doesn't say, this is the way you should be, or this is the way you need to be. It helps you understand your own thought patterns and feelings so that you can understand how they're affecting your life. And it provides you with a set of tools to support your mental health, like mindfulness. But it really is this act of kind of non-judgmental discovery If you think of the therapist paradigm of, I'm really angry about this. Well, why? Well, because of this reason. Well, why? And you're using that to understand the root of your anger. And then through doing that, there's likely some sort of alleviation of distress or a degree of clarity that's gained, but it's not being prescriptive in that process. It's not, I feel angry. Well, you shouldn't feel angry. It's more, let's get to the root of that, or understand really how your behavior, your patterns, or your past experiences are affecting your current happiness and situation. Then if I think of something like life coaching, how does that differ from therapy? Well, life coaching then focuses on the present and the future, but it's also not prescriptive. So you come in with a goal and your coach works with you to understand the best means of achieving that goal. So philosophy, I think, in a different category, because it transcends this. I've tried to make this argument. Therapy is looking to the past. Coaching is looking to the future. I think philosophy transcends this division because it's a prescriptive account of how to live with both therapeutic and coaching aspects. So it's a bit less past oriented than therapy, but it wants you to understand your thought patterns and your feelings. It's a bit less past oriented because I think there's like a bit less of a emphasis on just like self-discovery. You don't hear a lot in Stoicism about like, what happened to you as a child. Let's go through your formative memories, but that we do want to understand why you think and what you think it. It's a bit less future oriented than coaching because they're not just going to take for granted, oh, that's your goal. That's fine. Let's run with it. But it does want to help people navigate acutely frustrating situations. But it provides this, it provides this prescriptive account of life that combines both the past and the future aspects. I've got some examples of where I think Epictetus does some coaching, and jumps into that. But anything you want to add to that distinction before I get into that?
Well, maybe your examples will help
Yeah, sure.
tease this out, but I'm curious about the past, present, future type framing.
So let me jump into this example with Epictetus. So there's this example in Epictetus Discourses 1.11 where a father runs away from a sick daughter. I've talked about this example a lot because I think it's such a great passage, because he's just like, my daughter was dying. I was freaking out. I didn't know what to do. And I ran away. And Epictetus talks to the guy. And Epictetus helps him understand his feelings. In the situation, he's basically saying, you claim you want to be a good father, you claim you love your daughter, but these are like not really ways of achieving those roles. And that's not really, you've got this kind of inappropriate fear of death and not understanding that, you should have accounted for that when you love a mortal thing. So Epictetus is like, he's working with the guy to help him understand his feelings, like, why are you afraid? Well, I'm afraid of her dying, but like, is that something you should be feeling? Does that make sense in this situation when you knew you took it on as a father? And so that's a kind of therapy, but then it's also prescriptive. He's like, this is not the right way to be. You're failing to live up to the natural role of being a father. And then I think he also then kind of coaches, maybe not in that passage, but in other passages, the Stoic coaches you, is prescriptive about what goals are and are not worth having, and will make fun of you and mock you if you have a bad goal. If you want to become rich and famous, that's the stupidest thing. But if you have a good goal, like you want to be a philosopher, well, then he's going to coach you on how to achieve that. Well, you should study these books. You should read these dialogues. You should, put into practice what you say. So it incorporates those therapy and coaching aspects. Stoicism does, but it differs in these main ways. So it offers a conception of the good life, which is what makes it prescriptive. There's better and worse ways to live. And while it incorporates the backwards focus of therapy and then the future focus of coaching, it doesn't do either of these as purely because it's prescriptive. It's like, you can't have a non-judgmental environment of understanding your belief when you're with a Stoic, because there are constantly judgments. Some beliefs are good and some beliefs are bad. Some beliefs are worth having. Some are true and some are false. So it's not just like, I just want to understand what you're thinking. It's like, no, I want to understand what you're thinking so I can correct it, because you've got a lot wrong going on. And then you also can't have non-judgmental support of your goals, because some goals are bad. Some goals aren't worth pursuing and others are. So I guess the first argument there is that, like, to re-summarize that, I'm framing therapy and coaching as being not prescriptive. Therapy and coaching is present and past oriented. Coaching is future oriented. Stoicism dives into both, but its main distinction is it offers like a really robust conception of the good life. So yeah, you need to understand your past, you need to understand your future, but we're not doing that in a non-judgmental environment. Um, yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's useful. I think that first point you hit on is absolutely correct. This idea that if you're investigating, if you're doing philosophy, especially if you're thinking about a particular school, that school is going to have a view on what it is to live a good life. And it's not going to be shy about promoting that at all. Whereas many therapeutic frameworks are meant to work with, a range of different worldviews and not necessarily then don't conflict with those worldviews at all. So if you take a given system like cognitive behavioral therapy or acceptance commitment therapy, it'll promote something like living in accordance with your values, but
Hmm.
not say that much about what your values should be. And now there are some ideas about what your values should be, but they're certainly not going to be as opinionated, and they'll probably broadly fit in with what you could say, a Western liberal type framework about the kinds of lives, one could have. And they certainly aren't going to be as opinionated about the Stoics on that matter. Most, I think, therapeutic modalities won't be as opinionated. So I think that point is absolutely correct.
Anything else? I mean, I agree with you. I think I agree with you agreeing with me. um, yeah, I think
Maybe
there's. Oh, go ahead.
yeah. Maybe another way to think about the whether philosophy focuses more on the past or future or not, so that's the sort of temporal aspect, is how important is non-judgmental inquiry into the practice, and in particular inquiry about yourself, who you are, your experiences, and so on. And I think that's certainly important for philosophy, but perhaps there is less emphasis on it because you're just at the very beginning, you're thinking about what is really these big questions. What does a good life look like? And then how can I get there? And perhaps that's when these questions about the nature of you come into play. Another difference that's related to this is we're mostly talking about the frameworks or philosophies, if you will, some of the background assumptions to philosophical practice, therapeutic practice. But if many ways of doing therapy involve another person, and there's sort of this institutional fact that you are interacting with a therapist, and there's a relationship there. Not necessarily. You can also say practice a given modality through an app, just as you can practice a philosophy through an app. Use that as a tool. But the I think because of that, there's some amount of getting to know who you are, what your goals are, and anyone who's done therapy is familiar with this process of sharing, you know, sharing facts about you, both for the sake of self-discovery, but also to guide your therapist in a way so that they can help guide you, would be the theory. Probably, I think we're focused more about general frameworks, but perhaps the fact that you are often doing therapy with another person does influence the philosophy of therapy, as it were.
Yeah, I mean the reason I wanted to focus on the framework was because I mean for me the question is like which of these should I do and why?
Mm-hmm.
And then your point is there's these different modalities. I don't know. Honestly, if I could if Epictetus was around, I mean I'm sure there is philosophy coaching and you see that available. If Epictetus is around, I would love to go and talk with Epictetus. So maybe that modality is more like maybe there's something weird about philosophy where because I can read Plato, I want to go and read Plato instead of, I mean, like what I'm just thinking now is, well, why is there not more philosophical coaches? Why is that not a more popular approach? Should that be a more popular approach? Maybe it should be. But if not, maybe a reason why not is because to satisfy that prescriptive aspect, how should I live? I can go and read some of the smartest people that have ever lived. Like, it doesn't all have to be tailored, because parts of it can be universal. And maybe that's what makes that kind of solo aspect of it a little bit more viable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good. I think that's a good point, and I think it is a relevant point that there are philosophical coaches. And I suppose well, I suppose there is this issue. What's the difference between coaching and therapy? And at least in the States, coaching is much less regulated, which means you can't have coaches of all kinds, life coaches of all kinds, and you can't have a Stoic life coach, or you could have someone focusing on maybe more mystical type practices, or someone who just focuses on your career and that sort of thing. So I think coaching perhaps does give a little bit more of a, there are more possibilities there. Whereas therapy, not always, but it's at least a hybrid medical type approach where, there's this idea that in order to be a therapist, you need to be certified, and there's a link to medical institutions. But it's not just, of course, a medical institution. It's perhaps a little bit softer science, as it were. It's, um, so that distinguishes it from coaching and philosophy as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has a tighter relationship to our medical system, and kind of the structure in which you can access it is very different.
Right.
So with that framework in place, and maybe that's not I think that the framework could probably get a bit tighter. I think it gives us a starting point. We're on the same page about, look, the prescriptive nature and the unshy, the lack of pluralism. I'm a Stoic. This is the right way to live. I'm an Epicurean. I'm a cynic. This is the right way to live. That is a fundamental difference. And then they're aiming at wellness. They do it a bit differently. I've tried to argue forward looking versus backwards looking, and both a little bit more non-judgmental. Like, I think the therapy and coaching are both going to be critical of things that are not internally consistent. As you say you want a good relationship with your partner, but you keep doing these things to sabotage your relationship. You claim to me you want to get a promotion at work, but we've talked through these steps and you're not taking these steps. So, like, I think therapy and coaching are going to be critical of something that isn't internally consistent. But with the exception, as you said, of like, I've got ideations of murdering somebody. Unless you're going in and saying that, I have ideations of harming somebody else. People are going to be fairly non-judgmental about, let's just kind of figure out where you are. And if it's not working for what you want, that's an issue. But if it is working for you want, and it's not hurting anybody, that's fine. But then this other question I have is like, okay, we're all people. We're all trying to live good lives. Why should I turn to philosophy versus therapy or coaching or something alternative? And so my second argument is that Stoicism, I think, is at its best, or is the thing that we should do, and philosophy is the thing you should do when maybe you're not in a moment of crisis. You're in a position where you have the time and the energy to engage in self-transformation and build up a kind of resiliency or strength. So I stole this from Dorian on Reddit. Well, inspired by one of his comments. So shout out there. He was saying, if we think of our minds like a body, Stoicism is more like strength training than physiotherapy. And I thought that was a really compelling metaphor. You go to the gym, you strength train, you build up muscle, and then you can go and you can use that muscle to do things you couldn't do before. You become a stronger person. But that's not the same. I don't necessarily go to the gym for weightlifting if I've torn my pec muscle. If I go and I do that, I might just kind of aggravate the issue. So my argument is it's best used to transform your base level, not rehabilitate you in a moment of suffering. So, this is a messy metaphor, and people use strength training when they're recovering from injuries. But I I do come back to the idea. It's to prepare yourself for adversity and transform yourself into the person that can pursue the Stoic idea of the good life. So you use exercises like memento mori, premeditatio malorum to build resilience. And then you read philosophy, practice virtue, gain a better self-understanding to transform yourself towards the Stoic view of the good life. I think of the James Stockdale example. So he was just for those that are maybe not familiar with James Stockdale, he was a member of the fairly senior member of the United States military, shot down over Vietnam, was a prisoner of war for 7 or 8 years. But he also had a master's of philosophy and read Epictetus quite thoroughly. And he used Stoic philosophy to emotionally survive that experience. And I think of that, it's like there's a person in a downtime who used philosophy to transform himself, improve himself. And then when the challenge came, he was able to face the challenge. So that for me is where philosophy and Stoicism is at its comparative best. There's not an acute crisis. You're able to just transform yourself like the person who's able to build muscle through weight training. And then when the moment comes, they're able to actually lift the weight because they've spent the time putting in the practice. What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, I think I agree that it would be better if you're able to transform yourself through philosophical practice such that you can weather adverse events and the storms of life. And, that's a better place to be in than, being at sea when a storm comes and being unprepared and such. But it is true that many people discover Stoicism after a setback, whether it's a breakup, a serious injury, becoming fired, losing a loved one, whatever it is. That's how many people discover Stoicism, and they do find it useful for working through their obstacle, working through their grief. And perhaps in some sense, it would be better if they had discovered Stoicism earlier, and that's what many people come to believe. But that doesn't mean it's not useful for managing these stressful and tragic type situations. Which I understand. You're not saying it's not useful, but I would just say it still can be, exceptionally useful, exceptionally powerful. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't underrate that.
Well, let me get into the next part. I mean, my claim, I'm trying to make some sort of claim here, is that it's probably, I think, worse than, at least, if not maybe overrated. I mean, I'm interested in what other people feel about this, about dealing with acute trauma. That's my third claim. And this is where therapy comes in.
Yeah.
But I guess we want to draw, maybe I'll argue for that. But I think the nuance here is that I think maybe I'm arguing that it's like a bad thing to do. It's clearly very helpful if you've been studying it beforehand. And it's clearly very helpful if you turn to it for the right reasons at the right time. And maybe I would change my argument to be something like, it's bad if you're looking for it like a short-term remedy. If you're looking to just apply it, I'm really hurting. I'll look for anything that makes me hurt less. Maybe I can use Stoicism to help me hurt less. I don't want to judge people that have come to Stoicism in that case. I'm not saying that's the wrong reason to approach it. You've got a problem and you're looking for a solution, and that's right.
Perhaps there is perhaps something that you're touch on and that we've touched on before is perhaps not so much as preventative aspect, but the transformative aspect of philosophy. Pierre Hadot almost talks about it as a conversion. And I guess that's that idea that if you take it seriously as a way of life, even if you come to the philosophy after a setback, you realize what it's about isn't just about overcoming setbacks or something like this. So there is that related idea that doesn't touch on as much as the preventative type point, which maybe gets into this third claim where perhaps your views there are means that are more effective for acute trauma, pain, and such. But I think there is sort of there certainly is that, I don't know if I want to say deeper philosophical point, but there is that idea that if you take it seriously as a philosophy of life. It's about life as a whole, not just preventing pains, overcoming obstacles, and so on.
Yeah, I think this is the right answer. And that was like kind of the missing piece of the puzzle. Thanks, Kel. Is that, if you approach it as a holistic, transformative philosophy of life, then, the fact that, a loved one dying, some sort of significant change, some sort of painful breakup turns you to philosophy, well, then that's a great thing. I'm not saying don't go to philosophy as a transformative, way of improving your life, because things have got to be okay before you're allowed to do that. No. If that turns you there and you're approaching it for the right reasons, that's a great thing. Something I'm really positive on. I think what I'm criticizing, or I think what Stoicism fails to do, is it fails to act like it's not actually a very good anesthetic. It's not actually a very good mechanism of like, I'm hurting and I want to not hurt short term, or I want to kind of get my emotions under control. So this is the way that I've framed it here. I said, it's actually pretty bad at dealing with issues beyond your current level of progress if we view it just as a means by which to deal with those issues. So if I'm encountering grief that I'm not able to deal with yet, then I think that sometimes, philosophy might not, especially if you're already well versed in Stoicism, if it's beyond your current level of progress, it might not be the right thing to turn to exclusively in that moment. I think in that moment, this is where therapy or medical intervention or kind of more traditional intervention can help. And I think if you look at the short-term therapeutic strategies in Stoicism for moments of extreme grief, moments when the Stoics would say, you're in the kind of throngs of madness, you're not acting rationally, you're really, you're overcome by a passion. They're not that compelling, I think. Things like try to convince the advice they give to Stoics to people in these kind of moments of extreme kind of concern or anxiety or grief is you try to convince the person that grief's not appropriate. You try to wait and ride out the extreme wave of emotion so you can reason later. Try to reprimand excessive grief. You try to sympathize with them, but you don't empathize with the person grieving. And I think all of those are just like, they're not that great strategies if we're just thinking about just the issue of like, I'm really sad, I'm really angry, I'm really anxious, and I need a response or a solution to that kind of short-term problem during a crisis in my life so that things don't continue to spiral down. I think the Stoic tries to make you strong enough that you don't enter in a passionate state. That's what Stoicism does, but it isn't the best at actually dealing with those intense emotions. I think therapy is better here. Then when the emotion has subsided or you've started to heal, you can use Stoicism to reconceptualize the situation. You can use it to change the way you think about the situation, provide it with more meaning, with more nuance, and philosophy can change your perception of death or loss or failure. But in terms of, I think, that really acute, passionate state, probably therapy is a better mechanism. So I've nuanced my argument a bit, but that's what I'm arguing here. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, let's see. I think there's sort of 2 points here. One is about the comparative value of the Stoic framework versus the therapeutic one. And then another is about sort of searching for a solution when dealing with an acute trauma. So acute trauma can be a range of different things, of course, but if you're thinking about, it can be anywhere from serious anxiety to the pain at losing a loved one to perhaps something that, you have an acute trauma that sets off a schizophrenic response or something like this, which is certainly more extreme, and perhaps, Stoics don't have too much to say about schizophrenia. So maybe that's an easy win for the therapeutic side. But I think when what you're talking about isn't so much that, but some of these, these more extreme events of ordinary life, right?
Yeah. I mean, let me give you an example to make it more, I would say extreme events of ordinary life. I'd also say James Stockdale in his book, he gets shot down in this prisoner of war camp. He's applying Stoicism. he has this chapter where he says, I tried to tell it to somebody else. I was like, hey, you should start using the Stoic philosophy, or you should think like this. And the guy was basically like, hey, screw off, man. Like, I don't want to hear any of that. And I think that's kind of that. I mean, people also have that response to therapy, I guess. But is that kind of that? I guess it's this view of when you're in that fight or flight response, when you're in that, like, I just need to survive kind of moment, um, actually attacking philosophy as a holistic view of life, as a transformative project, is probably pretty difficult, probably above your capacity if you really are in that fight or flight mode, and more something that kind of helps you regulate, gets you back into like a more secure position sooner, is probably more helpful. And I think that therapy does a better job of doing that.
Yeah. Well, I suppose this connects to, so there's a comparative point, and then maybe there's this other point about searching for a solution to an event like this. And I mean, I don't think therapy is very good at addressing the, what it is to be a prisoner of war, or what it is to, experience a loved one dying. And I wouldn't suggest necessarily turning to therapy in either of those events. I think those are just terrible experiences, right? That we are going to encounter, and there's just going to be some amount of pain, suffering that any ordinary human is going to experience in those circumstances. So I suppose I would push back at this search for solution to begin with. You have, like, life is just tragic, and I think there is something misplaced in just trying to come to Stoicism as a solution that's going to get rid of, your acute pain at the moment, when you're not at the right skill level, you haven't done the preventative work, and you're just suffering. You're just sort of reaching out for what's off the shelf because something terrible has happened. But I think, therapy is just that, often just another thing on the shelf that someone's reaching to, when really, these extreme grief is totally normal. Like maybe the prisoner of war's example isn't super useful for most of us, but some feelings of depression after being fired and unemployed, and struggling with feeling like nothing's going right in your life after you're trying to search for a new job, that's in a way, perhaps a very useful Stoic teaching here is that you're trying to focus on what you can control, and those sorts of natural impulses are out of your control. And that's I think that's a useful frame for people. And there are other useful framings that come to that insight as well. But I would push back on this point that, there doesn't always, sometimes it's just, these are ordinary life events. You don't necessarily need to go to a therapist or perhaps even a philosophy to make sense of them.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting perspective. You're saying basically this is the wrong way of thinking about, if it's like, what can I pull off the shelf to solve this issue? You're asking the wrong question to start with, and you're not going to be happy anyway you land. I think it kind of, I mean, you're committed to the idea that it breaks apart the medical analogy then, right? Because yeah, you're going to break some bones sometimes. Yeah, you're going to, get a cold or a flu, but there's still medicine we can take. There's still kind of ways of helping that. So are you saying that there's just like kind of tragedies that we shouldn't be approaching in this way? Is that
Well,
yeah? Is that what you're saying?
yeah, I think it's a little closer. The medicine example is useful because it's I think what I'm sort of saying is that by going to therapy, you're like over medicalizing, which is an issue. If you have some it might be bronchitis or pneumonia, where people used to, offer many different treatments to lower the amount of coughing that occurs to this. But this is not useful at treating the root cause. And I think there's, this general idea that you can over medicalize something. Sometimes going for a solution right off the shelf isn't as good as waiting it out, or perhaps some other solution. So I think that that's closer to what I'm saying, is that by reaching for a quick solution off the shelf, you're sort of assuming that and ignoring the reality, this is an ordinary life event, and there are, there are risks to therapy. There are risks to a variety of different medical treatments. So you're just exposing yourself to those.
I mean, I think there's something compelling there about, I mean, I guess the kind of meta judgment of what I'm feeling is not appropriate, and so I've got to do something about it in the short term. But you're judging that just because it feels bad, not because you believe Stoicism, and so you have a reason for thinking it's not appropriate or some sort of like consistent foundational belief. It's just like I just don't want to feel this way, and so you're kind of medicalizing something that is a normal way to feel, either just is a normal way to feel, or is certainly normal with the kind of the way you view life at the time. I guess the pushback here, when do you, so if you're undermining this, when in your view, what's your view on when should someone turn to philosophy versus turn to therapy? If Stoicism has this transformative component, it has this resilience component, and it's at least on par with dealing with an acute issue, or maybe we shouldn't be trying to pull anything off the shelf to deal with the acute issue. When is your view? You're giving somebody advice. When would you recommend therapy or coaching instead of philosophy?
Yeah, it is really hard to say. At a first pass, or maybe one way to put this, there's sort of a selection type effect that occurs perhaps with therapy, with philosophy, where if you know a little bit about Stoicism, or someone knows a little bit about Stoicism, they genuinely felt it spoke to them, then maybe I would think it would be useful to share more about Stoicism for to that person. Maybe that would be a useful thing to do. Whereas other people who don't, have never heard about Stoicism, are not in any way interested in the Stoic aesthetic, I would say. Greece, Rome doesn't speak to them. They hated Gladiator. That's not quite it. But there's a kind of person who I think that, the Stoicism is a logical, analytical, philosophical system. And some people just don't think like that. And they might benefit more from a relationship with a therapist in front of them, or perhaps, the language of compassion inspires them in a way that the language of virtue doesn't. So something like compassion focused therapy might be a better route for them to take. So perhaps that's a little bit of a dodge, but I do think it depends on the person. And I don't agree that with the general view that if you're having in a serious issue, then you should go to therapy. I think, just it depends on who you are. I
Yeah,
think that's something
I
I would push back against.
I guess I also just want to say that I'm not committed to that view either. That you should, if you're having a hard time, you should go to therapy is not something I'm committed to. I'm more committed to someone having a hard time and asking for help.
Yeah.
And then what advice do you give? And I'm still not sure I would tell that person to read Epictetus instead of going to see a professional. And probably for the reasons you raised, which is that Epictetus is going to maybe be the right answer. Marcus Aurelius, or your Stoic of choice, is going to be the right answer for a certain person. Like maybe it's this thing where therapy, because it's amorphous and it's non-prescriptive and it's relational, so it's a bit more subjective.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe because of that, you're more likely to get a 5 out of 10 experience more broadly. Whereas Stoicism is the kind of thing where a person thinks, well, this is a bunch of garbage. Or they think, well, this is life-changing. I'm really trying to think of that example. Somebody's like, hey, Caleb, I'm having a really hard time. What do I do? Versus somebody saying, like, I think if somebody said, I don't know how to live, kind of confused, kind of feel like I don't have meaning, kind of feel like amorphous, I would say you should you should learn about some philosophy as a way of life. Still going to be some people that it doesn't do it for them, but that's the advice I would give them. But if somebody came to me, and they said I'm having a really hard time, I probably wouldn't. And I think that's my attempt to try to explain why. Do you feel the same
Yeah.
way, or do you think we can't answer that holistically? It's case by case. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a tricky issue. I wonder. I think I do sort of think it depends on the details. just to, so, hundreds of years ago, the typical person, if they didn't have a specific intervention in mind, they might say, go to the priest, or, see that member, find in our community who's very good at dealing with these sorts of issues, whatever it is. And I think the therapist is basically just taking the place of the role of the priest, and it's just some third party to, shovel people off to, would be, the strong way to put it. And as opposed to thinking through, what exactly is this person facing, I, I think, if they're depressed because they haven't found a job and for 6 months, then I think, that's, then, what I can offer there is perhaps more solution oriented. I think the problem really is that, they don't have a job. They've lost a sense of community. Perhaps they feel like they don't have the purpose they once had. And to, and anyway, I can help with that. That might be, that could be a useful thing, whether that's trying to provide a sense of community or help them find a job. If it's a different circumstance, you haven't found work for years or something like this, and you're struggling with depression, people around you, you're socially isolating, then, I mean, and, maybe that person hasn't tried therapy at all, then that might be a place where, look, this is something you can try, would be an appropriate thing. If they're in any way interested in philosophy, then I would suggest philosophical works. But otherwise, I don't recommend philosophy to people too often, unless it's something I feel like they would gel with. Unless it was, people like to consume all sorts of media, so perhaps there's something closer to who they are that might speak to them.
Well, to shoehorn that, I'm trying really hard to stick to my framework, Caleb, and you're trying to break it apart. I mean, the example of the person, I'm unhappy because I've been unable to find a job for 6 months. That for me is a coaching issue, at least in the way I framed it, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to help that, not by having you talk about why you think you need a job to prop up your self-worth and the childhood experience that caused that. I'm going to help you find a job. Here's like some strategies for networking or, developing your resume or things like this, right? That's a coaching question. And then we've got this kind of almost something I'm taking from this conversation is like, well, maybe therapy has this kind of relationship aspect for a reason. It serves this kind of communal role, this discussion-based role. It was previously achieved by Christianity, religion, and more predominantly a relationship with priests or something like this. And then maybe you've got this third bucket, which is kind of like meaning, purpose in life. And again, that was probably also achieved by religion more often. And then I think what I was thinking your point was like, yeah, sure, it can be philosophy, but I don't recommend it for many people because that's such a personal thing that like if it doesn't hit, it's not going to hit. And maybe for them, that's like reading books or listening to music or watching art or engaging with other kinds of art. Like there's lots of things that people can consume to find meaning or purpose or, a sense of something greater. And philosophy can be one of those, but it's not something, because when push them stuff, you're right. Like I don't go about recommending philosophy to my friends and family, maybe holistically, but certainly not Stoicism because it's almost so personal, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe I say like, hey, you should kind of read some philosophy. It's interesting, but I would never say like, you got to read Stoicism. I mean, we all try that once or twice and it doesn't go as well as we expect it to. Yeah.
But one thing I do also want to say is that sometimes that does mean using some of the Stoic techniques, even ones you labeled as bad ones. Sometimes it does work to tell someone that their grief is not appropriate, or to just wait it out. For some people, that can be effective. For others, it's not. I think that probably gets to the personal nature of this, and perhaps I think that's not the selection of the Stoics' best therapies for managing grief, but I mean that can work for some people. Just telling someone to snap out of it, and they realize they were in a fog, and then they get up and are back at it. But for others, of course, that's completely going to misfire.
Yeah, this is from Margaret Graver's Stoicism and Emotion. I think it's from Seneca. that's pulled from. It might be from some Chrysippus. The list that I gave is, I agree, it's not the strongest list, but I think it's the kind of list that is like, it's what you do for somebody else. So the list
Mhm.
again, it was like, try to convince the person that the grief's not appropriate, try to wait until and ride out the wave of emotion, reprimand excessive grief. So like actually criticize them, like stop your whining, and then sympathize with, but don't empathize with the person grieving. So yeah, sympathy is something that a therapist might do to some extent. And so, yeah, I agree. It's not the strongest list, but I think it's because it's restricting to the Stoic techniques that you do for another person, not the Stoic techniques you do for yourself.
Mhm.
Maybe you would add there, read them some Stoic philosophy or something. But like the other ways of dealing with Stoic grief are kind of self motivated, right? Like change your perspective, consider, uh, you know, uh, consider these different ways of thinking about the situation, reframe it. But they're not things that the Stoics were recommending you do to other people.
Yeah, well, I suppose something people find so valuable in Stoicism is the dichotomy of control and thinking about what they can, what is it up to them or what isn't. And I think that's something I will, if I won't explicitly mention, but I will at least, try to communicate that idea. And often I think something one can't control, especially when experiencing, some extreme life event, it are those negative reactions. That's just, you can't expect something tragic to happen in your life and not feel bad. And sometimes that can be a useful reminder for people, or especially if they might be prone to uh, judging the fact that they have these negative reactions, or somehow set an expectation for themselves that they not act like that. And I think that's not necessarily a Stoic idea, and that can be expressed in other ways, but yeah, it can be useful.
I think you're right that you can have some success presenting Stoic philosophy in just common sense language. You don't
Mhm.
need to necessarily bucket it as part of this holistic system, but just, yeah, try to focus on the things that are up to you. Try to like expand your perspective. Is this going to matter to you in 5-10 years? You can kind of have these kind of exercises or question like, did you expect nothing like this to happen? Like, do you expect this to never happen? Have you thought maybe, this was a necessary thing? And consider how the necessity of it changes. Maybe you're not a victim. Maybe it's not. Um, have you thought about how it's something other people have handled before and you've handled before? These are kind of things you can talk about in common sense ways. And that is something I do. I don't think I think I absolutely give that advice. I don't think I frame it as part of Stoicism when talking to non-Stoics.
Mhm. Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
any last ideas?
Well, one last idea that I think is worth mentioning, especially when you're thinking about the case when someone comes and asks for help. I mean, sometimes the right answer is just, I don't know. I don't know how to help you is sometimes the right answer, especially if it's something I haven't experienced before. I think that, or, don't have much knowledge about. I think that would fit, perhaps with many philosophies and general common sense is, not to claim knowledge when one doesn't have it, and not to claim expertise when one doesn't have it. So I think that can also be a fine response, and is certainly the appropriate one if I don't know how to help at all.
Yeah, we don't have to. You don't have to have the answer. Um, and sometimes that's, as you said, it's better than pretending like you do. Certainly, false confidence. Knowing you're ignorant is certainly better than false confidence. Agreed.
Awesome.
Great. Thanks, Caleb.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.